Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Monday, the 18th. And you can see in the notes below that today is Frankenstein. And I wanted you to watch the iconic 1930s version of Frankenstein, which has become part of our popular culture. I warn you right now that the film is quite different than the novel, but if you still haven't finished reading the novel in its entirety, this gives you a little bit more time. So you shouldn't think of the film as a adaptation of the novel that is verbatim. Think of it as perhaps two different texts. And I think they both have strengths and they both have weaknesses. In terms of what we're reading about with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Mary Shelley is a name you might be familiar with. She's the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, very famous feminist. One of the things we need to talk about in terms of this text is the feminist element. In fact, Frankenstein is a text that I also assign in my Women in Literature class. Mary Shelley was the wife of the famous romantic poet Percy Shelley, something that I had mentioned in some of your discussion forum responses when you were talking a little bit about some of the elements of Gothic. And the story was written as part of a horror story competition when Mary Shelley and her husband and friends were vacationing, had some inclement weather, so decided to amuse themselves with writing horror stories. And Mary Shelley had a nightmare that night of the famous creation scene from Frankenstein, and she ended up creating the text Frankenstein, showed it to her husband Percy Shelley, who suggested some additions, which we'll talk about later, and then that has become the text that everyone is familiar with, not through necessarily Mary Shelley's writing, but through film industry, specifically the 1930s version of Frankenstein. So, as you know, Frankenstein straddles a lot of different genres, as the Gothic oftentimes does. I had mentioned that there are feminist elements in the text because we've got a female author writing a very male-centric story, which is something that we have to discuss. But it also is a text that's examined in science fiction. One of the things that we'll be talking about this semester is the distinction between the supernatural, that which cannot be explained through science, and science fiction, that which can be explained through science. It's just that the science hasn't gotten to that point of sophistication yet. So, the film itself is an hour and 10 minutes, so I thought that I would just basically leave you with watching the film, the famous director James Whale. I was able to find an online link for it where you could watch it for free, though certainly you can find the film in lots of streaming services as well. One of the things you'll probably notice about the film is how silent it is. So if you're watching the film in another venue, it should not have a soundtrack outside of the very beginning of the film. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next class, as well as talking about our first writing assignment, our first formal writing assignment. That would be paper number 1, which I have with a due date of the 25th of October, which is a Wednesday. But I'm encouraging early papers. Basically, we've got a rolling deadline for that first paper. So my hope is that by the 25th, you would have submitted it. But my desire is that the sooner the better for everybody involved once we start talking about writing a paper, which we will do next class. It will be a critical paper, approximately 4 to 5 pages long, and it will probably be addressing either Frankenstein or Poe's short stories, which is our next set of readings, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which are the readings following before your first paper would be due. And you'll be doing something comparable with the second paper, but you would be dealing with the readings from the second part of the semester, which would begin with Dracula and then ultimately end with Stephen King. So as I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that next class, and we'll be talking about the novel Frankenstein itself until the 27th. So we've got several classes devoted to Frankenstein and talking about writing assignments. Following Frankenstein, there will be some Poe short stories that I've assigned. Again, whenever I can find online links, I will provide those to you, much like I was able to provide, or able to find the link that I was able to provide for you on Project Gutenberg for Frankenstein itself. myself, though I personally prefer hard copies. But if you need to rely on an electronic copy, you can see that I've included that. And in terms of Frankenstein, that will be our attendance question for today. That after watching the 1930s film version of Frankenstein, and if you've seen it before, even better, because now you can watch it with a critical eye. But my suspicion is that for many of you, this will be a first viewing. So you want to watch it carefully. You might even want to take notes as you're watching it. But after watching the 1930s film version of Frankenstein, what is your response to this movie? And why? Again, on the discussion forum responses, there are no necessarily right or wrong answers usually. I'm more interested in your reasoning. And while you're not required to respond to your classmates, I encourage you to respond to your classmates. You are required, however, to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. That would give you a sense of what we would talk about during a class discussion. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And I'm curious to see what you think of the 1930s James Whale version of Frankenstein. Take care. Bye-bye.